Good afternoon, everyone. We'll be starting now. Professor Srinivasan has arrived. So, let's start the meeting. And as we move ahead in phase one of our Metamorphosis program, we are honored to have with us a distinguished expert in the field of design and innovation. Our guest today is Professor Srinivasan Venkataraman, an associate professor at the Department of Design, IIT Delhi. With a background in mechanical engineering and a PhD from the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, he has spent over a decade researching how we can make the design processes more creative, systematic, and impactful. His professional journey is truly global, having served as a research fellow at the SUTD MIT International Design Center in Singapore and as a researcher at the Technical University of Munich in Germany. At IIT Delhi, he leads critical research in design thinking, prototyping, and AI in design. Beyond the classroom, he is actively involved in developing assistive technologies for the elderly and innovative training tools using virtual reality. He is not only an academic but a mentor to many startups and a key figure in the National Design Innovation Network. Given his deep expertise in how ideas transform into real world products, there is no one better suited to guide us through fundamentals of design thinking today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Srinivasan Venkataraman.
Thank you very much. A very good evening to all of you. Hope I am audible and visible. Sorry, I'm wearing a jacket because the air conditioning here is unusually cold, and then it's very difficult to control the temperature of the air condition because it's centralized. Nevertheless, let me quickly share my screen. And please let me know whether you're able to see. Is the screen visible? Okay, so
Yes, sir,
please
it
also
is
let
visible.
me know. Okay, all right, thank you. And please also let me know whether you're able to see the transition of the slides. Are you able to see a slide that says outline of the talk?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so a very good afternoon or good evening, depending on whether you have already digested your lunch. So my name is Srinivasan. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Design at IIT Delhi, and today I will give a very brief introduction to design thinking and focus on a couple of phases in a little more detail of design thinking. I call this a primer. Does anybody know what a primer is? Okay, so I don't know, maybe you could keep the...
I
Yes,
guess
go on, please
like
go on.
primer is like with respect to makeup, it's like the base of that. So I guess base.
Right, sure. So there are multiple contexts to that. So a primer is a basic coat of paint, or could be a basic coat for that is used for makeup. But then in this context, a primer is like a very basic and a foundational material here. So essentially, the content that I'm going to cover in probably what the next 90 minutes or so, it's going to be very fundamental, given the amount of time that that I have with me. Okay, so the broad outline for my talk will be as follows. I'll start with what is design, because I believe it is very fundamental to understand what is design before we dwell on what is design thinking. And then quickly go to why use design thinking, what are the benefits of design thinking, and then how to do design thinking. And then while I'm focusing on how to do design thinking, I'll focus on a couple of phases in more detail. And then I'll conclude the talk with some takeaways that you can recollect. And then hopefully there'll be enough time in the end for some question and answers and for some discussion. Okay. So we'll start with what is design. So design is one of those confusing words in English language that can be used as a noun, that can be used as a verb, can also be used as an adjective to qualify, for example, what kind of thinking you're doing, design thinking. So given this confusion, right? Anyways, before we sort this confusion out, let us start with an example, because one can always remember an example better than a theory, right? Okay, so all of us, or most of us, have had the fortune of living, or continue to have the fortune of living with our grandparents, and we have seen them age before us. And then what would aging mean? So aging would mean, apart from I mean, yes, of course, the physical organs in the body growing older, the memory in humans also starts to fade. the the five basic senses, they also start to fade, and then there are increasing number of illnesses and health disorders in the elderly. And then the most common form of remedy that is prescribed for the the elderly citizens, is medicines, right? They consume multiple kinds of medicines. Now, given this issue of this fading memory, sorry, let me quickly switch to the point. Given this issue of fading memory and senses and their health illnesses and so on, and if they especially have to take multiple medicines, and these medicines probably may be taken in different intervals of time, are taken in different doses and so on, and the elderly are often susceptible to make mistakes while they consume these medicines. Sometimes they might forget to take the medicines, or they make medicines in their intake, or they make mistakes in their medicine intake, right? But there are some solutions for these. Okay. um, there are reminders that one could set in their calendar, in a physical calendar, through which they would know what to take when, in what doses and so on. There are these small medicine compartments that are available in pharmacy stores, where one can sort the different medicines depending on when they have to be taken. There are multiple apps that one could have in smart devices that could remind them about what medicines need to be taken when, in what doses. And these apps can be combined with wearables, so that one does not always have to be in the proximity of these smart devices. And then there are next level of devices that not only remind what medicines that need to be taken, but they also dispense what medicines need to be taken when and in what doses. Of course, medicines have to be sorted in these various compartments, and one can then program these devices to say that these medicines have to be taken in these intervals of time and so forth, right? So, and there could be, of course, other kinds of solutions and so on. But what is of interest to us is, how does one undertake this journey, or this transition from identifying what are the real issues to arriving at solutions for these issues, right? Of course, we'll take questions in the end. I see a lot of questions that are also popping up in the chat box. We'll take up the questions in the end. Okay, so now with this example, we'll start with what is design, right? There are many definitions of what is design, but we will particularly stick to the definition that was proposed by Herbert Simon, and you should all read up about who Herbert Simon is. Okay. Now, as I said before, the word design can refer to a verb, can refer to a noun, and of course can refer to an adjective. And here is where we try to distinguish them. So when I talk about design as a noun, I am referring to the outcomes of the process, right? So broadly, a design is a plan or a course of action that is aimed at changing existing situations into preferred situations. Now the question is, why is this transition important? Why should one move from an existing situation to a preferred situation? Now, the issue with existing situations is that there are some undesirable or unsatisfactory elements in them. Okay. Now, and then preferred situations should ideally have none of these undesirable or unsatisfactory elements that were perceived in the existing situation, right? So in our example that we saw, the elderly have fading memory and senses. They have various kinds of health illnesses and health disorders. And consequently, when they have to take multiple medicines, they make mistakes in their medicine intake, or they forget to take their medicines. And depending on their condition, this can be very fatal to them, either not taking medicines or making mistakes in their medicine intake. And preferred situation should ideally be such a way that the elderly do not forget or make mistakes in their medicine intake, right? That is the preferred situation. So a design is a plan or a course of action through which one is able to make this transition from the existing situation to a preferred situation. So a design can have multiple avatars, can have multiple incarnations. It can be a product that is tangible, something that can be touched, that can be felt. It can just be a process, right? It need not be only tangible all the time. It can be a system. It can be a service like an app. It can be a combination of both a product and a service. So, for instance, you have Uber, you have Ola, and so on, where there is a combined offering of both product, that is the cab or the bike that you take to commute from one point to another, which can be booked through an app. So it's a combined offering of both a product and a service. And in fact, there's a system in place, so it's a product service system and so on. So a product or a design in general can take multiple incarnations depending on what problem you're trying to solve, right? So that is the word design as a noun, right? Now we look at the word design as a verb, just to clarify, right? Just to We use the word designing to refer to the verb form of design, okay, and we call it designing, right? So designing is a process through which designs are developed, and it broadly comprises of the following two phases, right? There is a phase of problem understanding, and then there's a phase of problem solving, right? So in problem understanding broadly entails or comprises identifying issues with an existing situation, identifying what are the undesirable or the unsatisfactory elements in an existing situation, and then trying to envisage what the preferred situation would be, right? So that is what problem understanding entails or comprises. Now in problem solving, right, depending on what undesirable or unsatisfactory elements that you have identified in the existing situation, you try and develop solutions in order to mitigate these undesirable elements or trying to eliminate these undesirable elements. And then you develop plans, right? You of course develop solutions and you test these solutions to see whether the undesirable elements are getting eliminated or not, and whether you are able to make this transition from this existing situation to the preferred situation. So that is broadly problem solving, right? Now this transition from problem understanding to problem solving is not always straightforward, right? So you identify some issues with an existing situation, you then develop solutions, and then you test your solutions. While you test your solutions, you might identify some more undesirable elements, so you go back and then try and fix them and so on. So as you test them, you'll identify more undesirable elements and so on and so forth, right? So the transition is not straightforward. There are a lot of back and forth transitions that are involved. The process is very, very iterative, involving a lot of back and forth transitions. Now, we've quickly covered what is design. So design as a noun, design as a verb. We now look at what is design thinking. Okay. Now again, just like there are multiple definitions of design, there are also multiple definitions of design thinking. But we will resort to, or we will subscribe to, one definition that is proposed by Tim Brown. So Tim Brown is the chair of a very famous product design consultancy company called IDEO, which is based in the US of America, the United States of America. IDEO has fantastic documentaries of their design processes, right? I mean, you just go to YouTube, check out IDEO, the design processes they follow, with particular focus on human-centric or user-centric design, right? So we will prescribe, or will subscribe to, the definition that is proposed by Tim Brown from IDEO, where he refers to design thinking as a human-centric approach to innovation, okay, that takes in methods, tools, and techniques of designers, right? Hopefully, good designers, in order to integrate the needs of the people, the possibilities of the technology, and the requirements for business success. So, there are three elements that are needed for design innovation, right? So the three elements are the desirability. The first is the desirability, is to really figure out whether there is a human need. What do humans need in order to mitigate their problems? So human need is one of the circles of this Venn diagram that I'm trying to show you here. That is covered by the desirability aspect, right? Now, it's not just enough if there is desirability. Okay, there's human need, and you need to come up with a solution in order to fulfill that need. But the question that you also ask is whether this need can be, whether the solution can be realized or can be created with our current processes and technologies or not. So that is the feasibility aspect, right? Whether the solution is feasible with whatever technologies that we have currently. Okay. And the third aspect is the viability, right? The viability economically or market wise. Okay, so I may have a human need which I'm able to fulfill with a piece of technology, for instance, but it is so expensive that my markets cannot afford to have, right? So that is still will not help us achieve innovation. So something has to be made at a price or at a cost that is affordable in the market, and therefore that aspect is covered by the viability. So essentially, when you are thinking of a problem and conceiving a solution, you need to consider all these three aspects. You need to consider the human need, whether it really fulfills a human need or not, whether the solution can be realized with current processes and technologies, and thirdly, whether it's viable for you to be able to produce and to be able to sell in the markets or not, right? So the example that I famously, explain in my classes, right? So even in any villages in Africa, there is a need for them to communicate, right? So an iPhone can be used for communication, but an iPhone is not really affordable in African villages, for example, right? So that will still not be successful if even iPhone is taken to their market, right? And so essentially, design thinking is about putting the humans or putting the users at the center of the process. And this process essentially involves taking in the methods, techniques, tools that are used by designers to solve innovation problems. And innovation is attained by integrating the desirability aspect from the humans, the feasibility aspect from the technologies, and the economic aspects from the viability aspects from the market and from the economy, right? So essentially, you need to have all these three integrated. Okay, so what are the USPs or what are the unique selling propositions of design thinking, right? What is it that makes design thinking unique or special? The first aspect is the human centricity. It puts the users or the humans at the center of the process, taking into consideration their capabilities, their limitations, their needs, and so on. And their inputs are taken in as many stages of the process, right? And the second USP is it allows people, and this people can include also people who come from outside the design domain, to be able to use the methods, tools, and techniques that designers use in order to address a wide spectrum of challenges for problems to be solved in these wide spectrum, right? And the third USP is that it has been applied successfully to solve problems in a wide variety of domains, and these domains include healthcare, technology, consumer goods, finance, education, and so on. Right? Often there is some kind of a misunderstanding. There's a misnomer that design thinking means only thinking like what designers do, right? But then it is not just thinking. I'll just come to this part. Design thinking is not only about thinking, but it's about thinking and acting like how designers do. And this will involve thinking, it will involve making solutions, it will involve prototyping solutions, it will involve testing those solutions, and so on and so forth, right? So design thinking as a paradigm was not new in with respect to the design domain itself, right? From the 50s and the 60s, the paradigm of design thinking has been popularized, but for some reason, people in the other domains were very reluctant to adopt design thinking. They felt that why would they need methods and tools from a different domain to be able to solve problems in their own domain? But somewhere in the 80s and in the 90s, the term design thinking was popularized by a couple of people, right? So one was Tim Brown, the chair of IDEO, the company, the product design consultancy company that I referred to earlier. And then Kelly brothers, Tom Kelly and David Kelly, these brothers actually started the D school or the design school at Stanford University in the USA. Right, so they were very instrumental in popularizing this term design thinking. Design thinking was not new as a paradigm, but the term was popularized by these sets of people. Now, why is design thinking important? I mean, what benefits do people get when they use design thinking? Now, let me try and explain this graphically, and then I will, of course, get into a little more details, right? I don't know how many of you have seen this graphic before. This used to be famous in the age where email forwards were quite famous. So maybe your fathers and mothers would have seen this image. Now, what this image explains is the story of how a project gets carried out, for example, in a software domain, right? And then I'll just use this as an analogy and try and explain how design thinking and why design thinking is important. Now, the image that you see on the left here at the top, this is how a customer approaches, right? The customer has a particular problem and is looking for a solution for the problem. Now, this is a very pictorial description of what the customer actually wants, right? The customer explains his problem. The project leader who tries to understand this problem, and this is the perception of the project leader as to what the problem is, for example, right? And then there's an analyst within the team who comes up or who designs a solution. And this is how he designs a solution for the problem that he has understood through the communication with the leader, right? And then there's an analyst who is another member of the team. And this is how he writes a code to be able to solve this problem. Okay. And okay, the solution is created. And this is how the business consultant, who is another member of this solution development team, describes the particular solution. Okay. And the entire while, this is how the project gets documented. Okay. And then once the solution is ready, it is then taken to the customer site and then it is installed at the customer site. And this is how the operations that are involved with those solutions are installed. And this was how the customer was built, right? For whatever problem that the customer had, this is how he was built. And this is how the solution was supported eventually, right? But in actual, what the customer wanted was a solution like this. Now, the point that I'm trying to make is the customer was involved only in the beginning of the process where he explained what his problem was, and then he was delivered a solution, and then he was built inappropriately, okay? And then what the customer actually wanted was a solution like this, okay? And if only the customer was involved in the multiple stages of the process, the customer would have clarified what exactly he meant by a problem like this, right? But the customer was not involved in the process, and at various stages in the process, there was probably misunderstanding, and people interpreted the problem in their own ways and developed a solution accordingly, right? They did not consult the customer anywhere in the process. They did not test their solution with the customer. They just developed a solution, probably tested within their own team, and then delivered it to the customer and built the solution inappropriately, right? So the point I'm trying to make is if only the customer was involved in the other stages of the process, the customer would have intervened and would have clarified saying, this is not what I meant. So this is the problem that I have. Now, once you have a solution, please let me know so that I can test the solution for the problem that I have. So if the customer had been involved in the other stages of the process, maybe they would have delivered a solution that actually solves the customer's problem. Okay, but this did not happen. So that's the point I'm trying to drive. So in design thinking, on the contrary, will involve using stakeholders or users in as many stages of the process or as many phases of design thinking as possible, right? It involves humans and users throughout the process. Now, what's the benefit of doing that? The benefit of doing that is It enables identification of the challenges or the difficulties that are faced by the users and the consumers. Okay. And then hopefully this will enable us to understand what are the capabilities and the limitations of these people. Now, based on that, one can create a good understanding of what their preferences are, and then build solutions accordingly, right? And consequently, then if we involve these people, the users or the customers in the process, their feedback can be incorporated in the various outcomes that we develop during the design thinking process. Okay. Now, when we are able to incorporate all of these, when you are able to understand the challenges that are faced by the users, you're able to understand what are their capabilities and the limitations, you're able to understand the feedback that they give at various levels or the various phases of the process, we are able to come up with solutions that have improved usability. Usability is the ease with which you can use designs or use products, and this consequently can improve the experience for the users, the use experience. And consequently, when usability and user experience improves, the usefulness or the utility of the designs can be perceived better. Okay. And this consequently can then improve the adoption of the designs. Okay. So when people are able to perceive the benefits of using something, then they will be able to buy more such units of these designs from wherever they are being sold, and this increases the adoption of the designs. Okay. Now I see some comments in the chat box saying that there is some lag. Now this might be an issue with the internet connection at your end. Please do check the internet connection at your end. Nevertheless, I think the organizers are recording this session, and hopefully they will share this recording after this session gets over. Okay, so we move on. I'll quickly explain some case studies of design thinking. I'll not get into a lot of details. So design thinking, as I mentioned before, has been applied successfully in a wide spectrum of domains. In consumer goods, for example, a company Braun, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this company. It's a German company that makes electromechanical products, consumer products, right? So they were very interested in creating an IoT based toothbrush. I hope all of you know what IoT is, Internet of Things. Now imagine a toothbrush, right? A toothbrush that can give you feedback on how effective your brushing has been, right? It can give you feedback on whether you missed out brushing any particular tooth or teeth, how harsh have you been on your gums, for example. A toothbrush that can also play music depending on how quickly you brush your teeth, right? Maybe the rhythm of brushing matches with the rhythm of music and so on, right? I mean, such a kind of toothbrush would be quite interesting. That is what Braun, the company, actually came up with. And of course, such kinds of products become more interesting for children who are very, very reluctant to brush their teeth. So I have a nephew and a niece, and then they're very, very reluctant to brush their teeth. So their parents have to really cajole them, force them to brush their teeth. And I imagine that if there was a toothbrush like this where they're able to hear rhymes when the brushing happens, I think they would very happily resort to brushing, right? And then design thinking was also resorted to in Pepsi company, where Indra Nui, a person of Indian origin, resorted to design thinking, and then with that they were able to get more revenue share. Procter and Gamble, P&G, the company, another famous company, well-known company in the consumer goods sector, used design thinking or user-centric design processes in order to increase innovations, which really consequently helped them improve their market share. So I'm not getting into the details. Of course, I'm happy to share all these slides, and then you can look at these links and then read more about them. Design thinking has been used in airports in order to make the queues more effective, in order to reduce the waiting time in queues. Design thinking has been used to reduce traffic congestion in cities. In the healthcare domain, again, there are some very famous examples. I don't know how many of you have seen an MRI scanner or used an MRI scanner, magnetic resonance imaging scanner. depending on which part of the body gets scanned, this can be an intimidating experience, especially for people or for children, people who have fear of closed spaces, claustrophobia. Right, so imagine, so there were hospitals that used to have these MRI scanners, and then this is a problem, especially for children. So children, they have to be scanned. Of course, if you have seen the scanner, you would see the scanner is kept in an isolated room because of the radiation. The operator of the scanner also sits in an adjoining room, right? So except the person who is getting scanned, there are no other people who are in the proximity of the scanner because of the harmful radiation that comes from the scanner. Right, so imagine if children have to be scanned, that their entire body gets into the scanner, and depending on which part of the body has to be scanned, so the scanning also takes that long. The entire body gets into a scanner, they have to be left alone with this equipment, inside the equipment, and so on. So children are very, very reluctant to get the scanning done, and therefore what the hospital decided was they will get them sedated and then put them in an unconscious mode before they are scanned. And then this was very inefficient for the hospital, because the queue starts to become very long, right? Because children have to be persuaded, and if they don't agree, then they are sedated, right? So this company G Healthcare decided to adopt design thinking, and then eventually what they found was children of a particular age actually start to, like hearing stories, they like to hear rhymes and so on. And so they came up with a very different scanning experience. So imagine a child gets into a scanner. While the scanning is being done, they are able to hear rhymes, they're able to hear stories, they're able to see animation of all of these happening within the scanner, right? And what happens because of this, their mind gets temporarily distracted, and they forget that their parents are not next to them, they forget that they are alone, right? So in the process, the scanning is done and their mind gets diverted, and this is what G Healthcare came up with, right? In order to improve the scanning experience, particularly for children, and this improved the efficiency of the queue in hospitals where these scanners were located, right? And similarly, there's documented evidence of design thinking being used in other healthcare sectors. Again, other kinds of examples of design thinking being used: Airbnb, Apple, Uber Eats, and so on. And even to come up with new curricula in education, design thinking has been used successfully, and so on. Right? Essentially, trying to understand what my users or my prospective users or consumers want, and based on that, to try and formulate a problem and to develop a solution. Right? And then there are many other successful applications of design thinking in finance, retail, NGOs, and so on. Right? Now, having covered what is design thinking, what are the benefits of design thinking, with some evidence of what happens when you apply design thinking, we'll quickly move on to how to do design thinking. Okay, there are several models, several frameworks, several processes that you can use for doing design thinking as a process. Okay, and this is one of the most adopted or one of the most used models of design thinking. This model was developed at the Stanford University by the Kelly brothers, Tom and David Kelly, that I mentioned before, the people who popularized design thinking, the term design thinking. So essentially what you see here, the 5 colorful hexagons that you see here, these are the different phases of a design thinking process, right? Some schools probably teach design thinking to their students, but nevertheless, let me go through each of these phases in a little more detail. So if you're not hearing it for the first time, you can pretend as if you're hearing for the first time, so that the content remains interesting for you. The first phase in design thinking is called empathize, right? So the word empathy means, in order to get into, so empathy really means, how does it feel like somebody? For instance, I would like to know, how does it feel to be one of those children from a school listening to Srinivasan, right? So I would like to see how it feels to be like one of you. So that is essentially empathy. You are getting into the shoes of someone and trying to feel like them. Okay, that is what empathy means. So do not confuse empathy with sympathy. Sympathy means feeling sorry for someone. That is not what we mean here. Empathy here means feeling like someone, trying to get into their shoes and then think from their context to really see what is the context that somebody is in, what are the pains and pleasures in that particular context, and so on. Right? Now, essentially, why we empathize and design thinking is trying to get into the shoes of our stakeholders, including our users, in the context of a broad problem that they have, and try and understand what are the different pain points that they have, what are the reasons for these pain points, and so on. Okay. Now, we might arrive at a bunch of things and we might not be able to, we will not have the bandwidth to solve all of those things. Okay. So what we do is we narrow down. We narrow down on what we think is the most important problem that can be solved, right? So that essentially becomes a part of define phase. Now we come to define. So we converge on what we think is the most important pain or most important problem that they have, which is worth solving, right? So we essentially define a statement of a problem that is centered around this pain point that our users may have, and with that as the basis, we are going to ideate. The word ideate means to generate ideas, to generate solutions for the problem that we have identified. While we generate solutions, we are going to try and generate solutions of multiple kinds that are distinct or as different from each other as possible, right? And we are going to evaluate these ideas or solutions to see how well they solve the problem that we had identified before, and then take those solutions that we think are worth solving. Okay, and with those best solutions we try and prototype, right? So the word prototype means to build a solution or to build an idea. An idea is typically only on a sheet of paper, right? So essentially we are going to build this idea further, we are going to embody this idea, we are going to represent this idea so that this idea can now be tested, can be tested to see whether it can actually solve the problem or not, right? So prototype would mean building that particular idea, a solution that was earlier on a sheet of paper. Maybe you would use maybe Arduinos, you might use Raspberry Pis, depending on what your solution is. You might use a computer program, you might build using a clay model, you might build using a Lego model, and so on and so forth, depending on what solution you have. So that is essentially a prototype. And then you're going to test the prototype to see whether the prototype or the solution that you have built actually solves the problem that you had identified before. Okay, so that is broadly the process. Okay, so you start by empathizing, understanding from your users what problems they have. Okay, by getting into their shoes, there are various ways, various methods by which you can empathize, and then you narrow down on a problem that is worth solving, perhaps the most important problem that they have, and then you try and come up with solutions or ideas for that particular problem, and the best solution that you take and you build that solution, or you prototype that solution. Okay, and then you're going to test the solution with your users. You cannot test the solution by yourself. The one who builds the solution, it is not adequate that you test the solution and you say, okay, it solves the problem. No, that is not sufficient. After you have tested the solution with yourself, the one who has built the solution, you're going to take the solution to your users and test the solution with them to see whether their problem, which was identified before, gets solved or not. Okay, and then what is important with design thinking is at each phase or each stage of the process, you are going to involve the users. In empathize phase, of course, you are going to take in inputs from your users, you're going to observe them, you're going to interact with them to try and understand what their various problems are in the context of the broad problem that you're trying to solve. And then while you define the problem, you again can go back to your users and then ask them if you think this is the most important problem that is worth solving, right? And when you're going to generate solutions or generate ideas for that particular problem, you can co-generate with your users. You can involve the users while you generate solutions so that the various features, the various characteristics that they would like to have in the solutions also gets incorporated, gets built in the ideas and solutions while you develop them. And of course, when you're going to test your solutions or test your prototypes, you're going to test with your users so that their feedback gets incorporated while you build the prototype or when you test the prototypes. Okay. So that is broadly the process. So unlike other domains, in design thinking, you're allowed to fail. Okay. Sorry. So you're allowed to fail in the sense that the earlier you fail, the better it is for you. Because failure will also mean you're trying to identify why something is failing, why something is not solving the problem. So you're able to reason that, then you're able to fix the solution, and then you're able to test the solution again to see whether it succeeds in solving the problem. So it is better to fail fast, it is better to fail early, so that you can then build a solution that is that has solved all those failures, and then that is hopefully the improved version of the solution is free from those failures, right? So that is broadly the process, right? So essentially the process that involves these 5 different phases, right? Now the same process also takes various avatars. Okay, I will not get into the details of all of these. Like I said, we can take the questions in the end, so please note down your questions. You can take the questions in the end. So there are the same process can be embodied, can be represented in different ways. Now this is another famous design thinking model, and this comes from the UK Design Council, the United Kingdom Design Council. And this process, it's also called the double diamond model, or it's called a 4D model. 4D would mean discover, define, develop, and deliver. Essentially, the first letters of the different phases that is gets captured, and that makes it 4D. It's also called a double diamond model because of the shape of the process. Right? It is represented like a double diamond. I will not get into the details because the details of the process are essentially the same. Okay. Now, this is another model. Again, let me not get into the details, but just to tell you that there are different models or different ways of doing design thinking. The underlying process is the same. This is a model of IDEO, which has 3 phases: inspiration, ideation, and implementation. Essentially, the same process that I mentioned before, right? That were represented using those 5 hexagons. That is the same underlying process here, except that it's given a very different name. And Google also has its own version of a design thinking, or they what they call is design sprint. So where they extend those 5 phases into 6 different phases. They have the understand phase, which is similar to the empathize phase. You have the define phase, which is again similar to the define phase that I talked about. Then you have the sketching phase, where you're going to come up with ideas, and then you're going to evaluate and then select what you think are the best ideas. So essentially, the ideate phase is embodied by phases 3 and 4 here. And then you have the prototype phase, which is phase 5, and then you have the validate or the testing phase. So essentially, those 5-phased model is extended or is stretched to make it 6 phases or 3 diamonds, right? Essentially, 3 different phases of divergences and convergences. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll get into this process in a little more detail. Okay, where I'll tell you what is specifically done in each of these phases, with some detailing of how you are expected to do each of these phases. And then I'll also share some examples from some projects that I have been undertaking, right, using design thinking as a process, right? So broadly, if you recollect, design is a transition from an existing situation to a preferred situation. A design is a plan or a course of action. Why are we doing this transition? Because existing situations have undesirable or unsatisfactory elements in them, and we would like to eliminate these undesirable elements, and our preferred situation should ideally have none of these, right? But before we do this transition, it is important to understand what are the undesirable elements in these existing situations. So in order to understand what are the undesirable elements, we undertake this empathize phase, right? To understand the existing situation, to identify what the undesirable elements are. Okay, we are trying to understand who our stakeholders are, what are their pains and pleasures in the context of the broad problem, okay, as experienced by our stakeholders. And from these, we are going to identify design opportunities. We are going to identify opportunities for us to come up with solutions, right? That is broadly the objective of the empathize phase. So we start with a broad problem. A broad problem, for example, could mean that I am very, very uncomfortable with a particular set of furniture that I have, without really pointing at whether is it the height of the chair that is uncomfortable for me. Maybe my pair of legs are too long for this to be fit within a chair, and so on, right? Maybe the backrest does not really take the shape of my back, and therefore if I have to lean on the backrest of my chair, it is not comfortable. Maybe the dimensions of the chair do not match the dimensions of my legs, my other body parts, and so I find it very, very uncomfortable. Maybe the table height is not appropriate for me to sit comfortably, and so on, right? So we essentially need to identify all of these things, and these details are going to be gathered through the empathize phase. We start with a broad problem, and then the outcome of this phase will be a list of pains and pleasures of our stakeholders in the context of this broad problem. And from these, we are going to identify some design opportunities. Okay. Now, there are various methods through which you can empathize with your stakeholders. Okay. But we start with a review of literature, right? And I'll tell you why we do this review of literature first. And then we're going to identify who our stakeholders are. Stakeholders are people who have stakes in the problem that we are trying to solve, or the problem that we are about to solve. And then we are going to take what is called as immersion and empathy, where we are really getting into the shoes of our stakeholders to be in the physical and mental situation that they are in the context of the broad problem, and then perceive what they are going through in the context of the problem. So to be able to do this, we are going to be using broadly interaction-based methods, observation-based methods. Interaction-based methods, you could be using, for example, interviews, you could be using surveys, you could be using focus group discussions, where you're going to be directly interacting with your stakeholders, including your users, and trying to understand what they are going through in the context of the problem to be able to nail down what is the exact cause for the problem. And interactions alone are sometimes not sufficient, because not all our stakeholders are as eloquent as we would like them to be. And so we undertake observations, right? Again, there are various means through which you can observe them. You can shadow them, you can do field visits, and so on. So when I say observe them, we are not going to be like Sherlock Holmes. We are not going to spy on anybody. We are going to be carrying out these observations with the permissions of the people that we are going to observe. That's very, very important. Now we look at each of these methods in slightly more detail. So why do we undertake literature review? Now, it could be that we started with a very broad problem, right? And we need to know whether the broad problem has been solved before or not, whether the problem actually exists, or maybe there could be a bigger problem that underlies this broad problem that we've identified. So literature will give us hints to see whether the problem has been solved before. Now, if the problem has been solved before, we also try and identify what are the existing solutions to this problem. Okay. And from these existing solutions, we identify what are their pros and limitations, what are their pros and cons in solving this existing problem that we have. Okay. Now, why do we do this? This is very, very important, because before we start solving a problem, we need to know what solutions, if the problem has been solved before, number one, and if the problem has been solved before, then what are the solutions to this problem? Now, if you don't undertake the step, unknowingly you may reinvent the wheel, you may reinvent an existing solution, right? And you don't get any credits for this, because somebody, you develop a solution, you take it to the market, and then you realize that a solution is already there in the market. So you have expended all your resources, including time, money, and so on, in reinventing a solution unknowingly, because you did not know such a solution existed. So before we actually undertake this process, it is important to do a quick review of literature to understand whether this problem actually exists, and if the problem exists, then what are the existing solutions to this problem. And then we try and identify what are the pros and cons of these existing solutions. And if the solutions already exist, then whatever solution we are going to come up with has to be better than these existing solutions, right? So there are various forms of literature that one could look at to see whether the problem has been solved before, and so. Okay, so once you have done this, okay, so then you identify who your stakeholders are. to the problem. I'll come to that step in a little more detail when I explain the project that I have at hand. And then once you've identified your stakeholders, you're going to interact with them. There are various means through which you can interact with them. You can do one-on-one interviews with them. You can do online interviews with them in case you don't have direct access to your stakeholders. You can do a focus group discussion with them where you gather a group of particular kinds of users, you pose questions to them, and then they respond to that particular question. So it's a very focused group. You're having a discussion with that group to try and understand what these particular group of users or consumers are going through in the context of the problem. And then you may also float questionnaires in the form of surveys. The Google form seems to be one of the most famous modes through which people seek responses for their questions. So you float these forms to people and you ask them or you request them to respond to these questions. And then you can analyze these responses to see what are the pains and pleasures of your users in the context of a broad problem. Right? Essentially, why are we doing this? We are doing this in order to identify these different things. So identify the various tasks that our users or our stakeholders undertake in the context of the broad problem. What are their behaviors? What are their attitudes? What are their perceptions? What are their thoughts? What are their likes? What are their dislikes? And so on and so forth in the context of the broad problem, right? And essentially, we are going to do these by directly interacting with them, either through interviews, through focus group discussions, or through surveys, right? And then we're going to identify what are their pains and pleasures, and this will help us identify where we can intervene and then create a solution. Now, all of these studies will require undertaking some form of a pilot study, some form of a test study before you undertake these studies with your actual users. Okay, so that's one form of studies through which you can understand what your users want, what are their capabilities and limitations. Other kinds of studies, of course, involve observations, right? Observations, you could be shadowing, you could actually go to the field and observe your stakeholders or your users in action. You could record all of this through video clippings, through photos, and make a movie and then analyze the footage to really see what essentially comes out of these. Okay, and again, through observations, your aim is to try and identify what are the various tasks that are undertaken by your stakeholders and users, what are their behaviors, what are their attitudes, what are their thoughts, what are their likes, dislikes, and so on. So shadowing means to be in the shadows of your users and to observe what they are doing in the context of the problem. Okay, I'll just quickly come to that. So you're not spying on them. Like I said before, you're being in the shadows, you're being very, very close to them and observing them, what they are doing and what is their state of mind, what are their behaviors, what are their attitudes and so on, and how well they're able to undertake these various tasks. And essentially from all of these, you're going to segregate what are the pain and the pleasure points. And it's important to plan these studies well. Again, you can undertake pilot studies. You can test whatever you want to do with some users and see whether things are going as per your plan before you undertake the actual study. And when you're doing observations, you're allowed to take notes, you're allowed to take photographs, you're allowed to take video clippings of people, but you do all of these only with their permission. Like I said, you're not spying on people. Okay. So let me come to the problem that, so this is a project that we undertook in collaboration with AIIMS, All India Institute of Medical Sciences in New Delhi. So essentially the doctors there who were one of our stakeholders, they came up with this problem. They came up with the problem that the elderly typically have to take multiple medicines, but they don't take their medicines, right? So we then wanted to create a solution that allows the elderly to take these medicines. Before that, we wanted to try and understand why the elderly are not taking medicines, right? So essentially, we identified who the stakeholders are in this problem, and our focus was on the elderly living in urban India. So of course, we looked at both the male and the female genders. There were urban elderly people in urban India, especially have caretakers or caregivers if they are able to afford. Okay, if not, the elderly live with their family members, with their guardians who take care of the elderly. And then there are doctors, okay, who they regularly consult and so on. So these are some stakeholders we identified. Of course, there are more stakeholders. So essentially, we undertook literature review. We identified a bunch of problems. We identified some existing solutions that are there for this problem. One of the things what we found out was there are a bunch of elderly who forget to take their medicines, and then there are another bunch of elderly who deliberately do not take medicines because they have lost interest in their life, because they are so far away from their children or their grandchildren that they have lost interest in their living. Okay, and so we said we are going to focus on the elderly who forget to take their medicines, or who make mistakes in their medicine intake. Okay, essentially we interviewed all these stakeholders, we observed these stakeholders, we spent time with them, we went to the elderly care homes, we spent time with them, we interviewed them, we observed them without really disturbing them. Okay, and then we identified a bunch of pain and pleasure points in their daily lives. Okay, so here are some pain points that we observed through our immersion, through the interaction, and through the observation-based methods that I shared before. We found that the elderly consume multiple kinds of medicines, and these medicines include both medicines that are prescribed to them by the doctors as well as OTC medicines, over-the-counter medicines, medicines that do not require a prescription from the doctor. The elderly have fading memory and senses. They are not able to see things very well. They are not able to hear very well. The sensation in their skin has gone down and so on. They are not very fluent with using technology, particularly using smartphones or with smart technologies. Even if they have smartphones, they use very few applications within the smartphones, primarily to, for example, to make calls, to receive calls, maybe to make a WhatsApp video call and so on. They forget to take medicines. They consume wrong medicines at the right time, and medicines at the wrong time. So essentially, if there are multiple medicines, then these medicines have to be taken in different intervals of time, in different dosages and so on. So there are all kinds of mistakes that are possible. So you take either the wrong medicines, or you take the right medicines at the wrong time, and so on and so forth. Okay. Another very interesting thing that we found was, even though there are solutions to help people remind what medicines need to be taken in when and what intervals of time and in what dosages, and then there are solutions that can also dispense medicines, that these devices or these solutions are very expensive, so expensive enough for even the urban elderly to be able to afford them, to be able to buy them, right? And these solutions seem to be primarily catering to the first world countries, to the Western countries, right? So these were some pain points that we observed. So a bunch of pleasure points that we observed when we carried out interactions and observations with the elderly, that some elderly live with their families, with the children and the grandchildren, and the family actually takes care of their medication needs. Elderly who are on their own, they also make notes on the pill boxes of the various schedule as to when these medicines have to be taken, in what intervals of time, in what dosages and so on. They have all kinds of notes, all kinds of labeling, including colored labeling on the pill boxes that they have, in order to help them identify and remember. Right? Many elderly that we observed, we interacted, rely on this piece of paper that is given by the doctor, which is a prescription. Right? So imagine what happens if they misplace this prescription. Right? Then they again have to revisit the doctor and so on. Right? Or until they revisit the doctor, they get a doctor's appointment, they keep consuming medicines, and it increases chances of them making mistakes, or increases chances of they forgetting to take the medicines. But what we also found was the elderly enjoy social company, right? So essentially, now based on this, we are able to create some design opportunities. We are able to see, okay, now how do we eliminate these pain points? How do we mitigate these pain points in order to get to the preferred situation? So we are envisaging the preferred situation now, envisaging a preferred situation that will not have these undesirable or unsatisfactory elements in them. So we are now asking the questions, how might we assist the elderly to prevent forgetting of their medicine intake? That is one opportunity that we have to develop solutions for. The other opportunity that we have is how might we assist the elderly to consume the right medicines at appropriate intervals of time in appropriate dosages and so on. These are some opportunities that we identified based on the pain points that we identified. Okay, so that was broadly the empathize phase, where we are getting into the shoes of our stakeholders, not literally, of course, figuratively. So we are trying to be like them and trying to understand what they go through in the context of this broad problem. Imagine if you or me, once we become old, so we actually in the empathize phase, we become old, and imagine that we are prescribed multiple medicines and we forget to take these medicines. So why is it that we are forgetting and so on? And we are trying to get as close to the situation as possible by interacting with the elderly and by observing the elderly, so that we are able to then simulate such kinds of situations and try and understand, try and reason out why it is like this, right? So we've identified a bunch of pain points and pressure points. We've identified a set of design opportunities. In the define phase, we are going to converge, or we are going to arrive at probably one opportunity that we think is worth solving. Okay. So based on this, we are going to discover and define a relevant design problem from the design opportunities that we have identified. And the starting point for doing this will be a bunch of pleasure and pain points that we identified before, and the design opportunities that we identified from the empathize phase. And we are going to identify a particular, a very, very focused problem that we are going to solve. Okay. And then we are going to arrive at what we call are some needs and specifications. Essentially, we are identifying what are the boundaries of our solution. So needs and specifications are the properties, the characteristics, the attributes that our solutions can have or should have. Okay. Now, there are again multiple methods through which you can do this. There is a method called how might we, which I think is essentially will be covered in the session this week and so on. I'll not get into the detail, but I'll quickly show you how this can be done. How might we is one of the methods through which you can formulate design opportunities, and then maybe you work within a team, and then they can all vote and then decide on what is the best opportunity that we have, which we can solve. Now, based on that, we are going to define our statement of the problem, design problem definition, or define our design problem, and then we are going to identify our needs and specifications, and we're going to prioritize them. I'll not get into these details because we still have another hour or so. So essentially, the method of how might we is about identifying or capturing design opportunities by positively reframing the pain points that we have identified from the insights that we have gathered in the empathize phase, right? Now, keep in mind, how might we is not about generating solutions yet. It is just about identifying what opportunities we have to be able to develop solutions. Okay, essentially, we're looking at what different directions for solving the problem, right? So essentially, it's creating a mindset where we are saying we are developing a belief that at least one solution can be developed for the problem, that the solution might or might not work, and we are open for all possible options. And we meaning that you are solving the problem together as a team, right? Often in design, an individual alone cannot solve the problem. You require a team, you require multiple perspectives, you require multiple opinions, and then with all these multiple perspectives and multiple opinions, you'll be able to holistically solve the problem. So teamwork is a lot of emphasis is focused on teamwork. So essentially, you are trying to frame as many how might we's from the pains and pleasures that you've identified from the empathize phase, with the intention of eliminating or mitigating the pains, either increasing or retaining the pleasures, or doing a combination of both these, right? Eliminating the pains and retaining or enhancing the pleasures. So here are some examples, right? So imagine, I mean, all of you use WhatsApp, right? And within a WhatsApp group, okay, you're a member of a group, there's a good chance that you miss out on reading some important messages. Okay, so WhatsApp group, the messages are really not sorted based on whether they are read or unread. Okay, so one of the pain points is that then the read and the unread messages are not clearly sorted. So there's a good chance that somebody can miss out on reading these messages. Unread messages are missed and not responded to, for instance. So then you're trying to identify how might we from this to say how might we ensure unread messages are not missed among a pile of read and unread messages. That is one way of framing how might we. Okay. A few more examples. Okay. Uh, the earlier versions of WhatsApp, especially if you're viewing someone's status. I don't know if people are old enough to be using a smartphone to be using WhatsApp, for instance. But there's a feature called as status, so you can view the status messages of all your contacts, and there's a chance that you unintentionally you're looking at somebody's status. And so everybody, if I, for example, look at my friend's status, he will know that I have looked at a status. So if a status message is viewed unintentionally, I don't like that, right? I don't like that my friend has noticed that I have viewed his status unknowingly, right? So there's no way for the user to have a control over viewing the status messages. So that's a pain point. And so a design opportunity is how might we provide more control for our users while they are viewing the status messages, right? Of course, the current versions of WhatsApp has already solved this, but this is with the earlier version of WhatsApp, right? And so on, right? So this is particularly with the IIT webmail system. I'll not harp about this example. Again, just a caution that you're not thinking of solutions yet. You're just thinking of different design opportunities that you have from the pain points that you've identified. Okay, so after you have framed all these how might we statements, you can vote within your team, and perhaps the most important how might we gets listed out, and then you can then focus on it. Okay, now I have a few more examples of how might we. Just one more example we'll focus on. Okay, now imagine that there is a multi-storied hotel. Okay, the multi-storied hotel has limited number of elevators, right? So if the users or the guests in the hotel have to commute to the various floors, they have to wait for the elevators to arrive in their floor, which can then take them to the floor that they want. And consequently, it takes too long for them to get to the floor that they want. Okay, too long for the elevators to arrive at a floor and to get to the floor that they want. And this is causing annoyance and irritation in the guests in the hotel, right? So here are some design opportunities that we identified based on some pain points through the immersion. Okay, how might we allow guests to quickly commute across floors? Okay, so that is what we want. And perhaps there are issues with the speed of the elevator. The speed of the elevator is sometimes can be too slow. So how might we increase speed of elevator, for instance, right? That might be one design opportunity we can look at. How might we increase the speed of opening and the shutting of the doors of elevator? I don't know how many of people have observed. Sometimes the elevators open and the doors shut at very low speeds. That can be very annoying. Or it could be actually be an issue where there are so many buttons within an elevator that it takes time for somebody to choose, right, to actually see which button they have to push to get to the floor of their choice. So how might we allow guests to quickly choose options from the menu of buttons that they have within the elevator, and so on and so forth, right? Or we just turn the problem, we flip the problem to really see. Now if you actually look at, there are particular standards for elevators, right? That elevators cannot travel at undesirable speeds, because it can again create a traumatic experience for people who are commuting with elevators. So there is a speed limit for the elevators. You cannot increase their speed. There is also a speed limit for the doors, right? The rate at which the doors open or close, you cannot increase their speeds, and so on. So you cannot alter the speeds. How can you cannot enable guests to quickly commute across floors, right? So then we flip the problem around and then say, how might we enhance the waiting experience for the guest, right? We know that it's going to take long for the elevators to arrive at a floor and to reach a floor of a guest choice. So how can we improve this waiting experience, or how can we improve the commuting experience for guests, right? And how might we enhance the commuting experience for guests and so on. So this is actually a real problem that happened somewhere in the UK, and the whole concept of playing music in the hotel lobbies while somebody is waiting for the elevator, or having mirrors within the elevator so that people can appreciate how beautiful they are or how beautiful their co-commuters are, was essentially about enhancing their commuting and their waiting experience. Anyway, we are not getting to the solution yet. This is just to say there are different possibilities that exist for the different pain points that we have. Or it could be that how might we enhance both the elevator waiting and the commuting experience for our guests, right? So essentially, you're then trying to come up with different how might we's that are possible from the pain points, okay? And then you're listing them down, and perhaps you can vote for and then see which how might we you would like to pursue further. Now, depending on that, you then formulate a problem statement, right? So you could say my problem is to allow guests to quickly commute across the various floors, for instance, or you can say is to increase the speed of elevators, to quickly shut and open the elevator doors, to allow the visitors or the guests, the commuters in the elevators to quickly choose options from the menu of the buttons that are there, to enhance the elevator waiting experience for the guests. And one way to do that is to entertain the guests while they are waiting for the elevators in a floor, right? Essentially, you are not developing a solution yet, but you are choosing different solution paths that you can strive for in order to get to a solution or get to a bunch of solutions to enhance the commuting experience for guests across the floors and so on and so forth, right? And it is very, very important that while you are framing these problem statements, you have to be as solution neutral as possible. Because if you fixate on a particular solution, then the nature of the human mind is such that it cannot get beyond that solution. So essentially, the way you frame a problem is very, very important, will help you decide what solution will you develop or what kinds of solutions you will develop. Now, here is another example, right? Solution neutral means that you are not biased or fixated on a particular solution while you are framing the problem or framing the statement of the problem. You are being unbiased by the nature of solution. Now, what you see here is an image of a very untidy garden or an untidy park that has a lot of I don't know, unnecessary plants or weeds that have grown everywhere. The grass is long, as perceived by the users. Existing lawn mowers consume a lot of electricity with a single Y. I apologize for the spelling error. And lawn mowers, you may have seen, they also create a lot of noise. So those are the pain points that were perceived by the users of this garden. So here are some design opportunities that we have. Okay, how might we keep the lawn tidy? For instance, again, one could think of different perspectives. How might we remove the weeds or the unnecessary plants periodically? That will help keep our garden tidy. How might we, or somebody can actually look at a very different way. Say that, okay, that will actually require maintenance, right? If I allow unnecessary plants to go, then it requires periodically for them to be cut. What if I prevent the unnecessary plants from growing, right? So that is another perspective that you can have. How might we prevent the weeds from growing? How might we trim the grass from time to time? That's another how might we you can have. How might we maintain the length of the grass, right? The whole concept of bonsai plants, I don't know how many of you are aware of the concept of bonsai plants, where these plants are injected with some chemicals that do not allow the plants to grow beyond a certain length, right? So there are trees that are, for example, you can have a bonsai banyan tree that will not grow beyond 1 meter or half a meter, for example, which are injected with chemicals that prevent them from growing beyond a certain length, right? The whole perspective actually essentially came from that, right? Again, we're not thinking about solutions, we're just thinking about various perspectives of the problem that we can have. Or now develop another perspective. How might we develop lawn mowers, which are used for removing weeds and for trimming grass, that can consume less electricity and generate less noise or create less noise? Yeah, one could have different perspectives, and one then creates a solution neutral problem statement from these to keep the lawn tidy. So that's essentially the problem that you have, to remove the weeds periodically. So essentially you're converting the how might we statement into a problem statement. How do we prevent the weeds from growing, to trim the grass periodically, to maintain the length of the grass, to develop a mower to remove weeds and to trim grass. And because one of the pain points is that the existing lawn mowers consume a lot of electricity and generate a lot of noise, to develop a mower that uses less energy and creates less noise or generates less noise. And one could also have a very different perspective now to say that, okay, I want to use solar energy to run my mower, right? So develop a mower that runs on solar energy, to develop a mower that uses mufflers or silencers that can muffle or silence the sound or the noise that is generated by the mower, to develop a mower that runs on solar energy and uses mufflers, right? And so on. So try and keep it as solution neutral as possible without fixating or being biased towards a particular solution, and so on and so forth. You could have multiple kinds of problem statements that you have. Okay. Now, in the context of the medicine reminder for the elderly, that was the project that we were working on. So this is the problem, that statement that we arrived at, right? Based on our studies during Empathize, where we looked at literature, we interacted with the elderly, we observed the elderly, and based on the pain points that we observed, based on the how might we derived from these insights that we got from the Empathize phase, we arrived at this problem statement. We essentially wanted to develop an affordable. Why affordable? Because existing medicine reminders and dispensers were very expensive, very so expensive that even the elderly living in urban India could not afford them. And we wanted to create a solution for the Indian elderly people, particularly of people more than 60 years age. And we wanted these devices to assist them with their correct and their timely medicine intake, so that they do not make mistakes in their medicine intake, and they are able to consume the right medicines in the right intervals of time and in the right doses, right? And then, so of course, then now we are deciding the boundaries of a solution. This is what I meant by needs and specifications. So we said, okay, now how many medicines should we account for? So what we typically found is, on average, people consume about 4 to 5 medicines. There are exceptional cases where people consume more than that, but then those are exceptional cases, right? So we said any device that we are going to develop will have about 5 compartments where you can store these medicines. And essentially we focused on medicines that are of solid nature, essentially meaning tablets, pills, capsules, and so on. We avoided syrups, we avoided all these ointments. At least in the first version of our design, we said it will have about 5 compartments. It will remind people to take the right medicines at appropriate intervals of time through multiple modalities, right? What whole multiple modalities we meant? It can be through audio-based information, audio-based signal. It can be a visual signal. Imagine LEDs glowing, and to alert the users that the medicines have to be taken. And then we were also thinking about tactile or vibration-based alarms, because the Indian elderly have weak senses. We felt that a combination of modalities, right, visual, audio, and vibration-based or tactile alarms can ensure that the elderly do not miss their medicines, right? We also wanted the reminders from these devices to be communicated to the elderly even when they are not at home. These devices are to be kept at home. So essentially, there will be some wearables which will be around the wrist, around the neck of the elderly, which will communicate with this big device which is kept at home, so that the communication from the device still happens when the elderly are not in the proximity of the device. So not only will this device remind medicines, but it will also dispense medicines from the device. Essentially, there will be these multiple compartments that will have the various medicines that they have to take, and then somebody has to feed in the prescription into the device, and then the device is so programmed that it can take in the inputs from the prescription, and then it will know what medicines need to be taken in when and what intervals of time, right? And then given that the elderly are very are not technology friendly, we wanted the device to be as easy to use for the elderly as much as possible, assuming that the elderly will be independent and then will be able to use the device on their own. And we also wanted the device to be affordable, and we wanted to keep the price below 5,000 Indian rupees, because that was a price that we were able to arrive at through our studies, to say that anything less than 5,000 Indian rupees, our elderly people in urban India are able to afford to buy these devices, right? So essentially, these are the boundaries that we have set for ourselves for this particular problem, and then we are going to develop solutions, right? So that is essentially what entails the define phase, right? And then we said these are the various functions that the device should have. It should remind medicines that need to be taken in appropriate intervals of time. It should dispense the right medicines in right dosages based on the inputs from a medical prescription. It should be able to track the medicine intake. So in case a particular medicine is missed, then there's a communication that goes from the device to the doctors, to the caretakers or the caregivers, so that they are appropriately informed, and if any action needs to be taken, can be quickly taken before time is lost, and so on, right? You can communicate with the other stakeholders. Imagine the doctor can directly communicate the prescription into the device. You don't need an external piece of paper, and the pharmacist knows that the doctor has communicated these medicines to the device, and then the pharmacist can see such a solution and then send their medicines, and then there can be digital payment and so on. So that's the kind of solution we are envisaging. And the next phase is, of course, now we have defined the problem, we have identified the needs and specifications for our solutions. We are going to come up with solutions. We're going to come up with ideas. So essentially, the objective is to generate a wide variety of multiple and distinct ideas for the problem at hand, and then evaluate these ideas against the needs to see whether it solves the problem or not, and take or select the best ideas forward. So we start with the design problem, or the statement of the design problem, and the list of needs and specifications we have arrived at. And our outcomes in this phase are going to be the list of multiple and distinct ideas, essentially a wide variety of alternative ideas that we are going to generate. And from these, we are going to evaluate and select the best ideas that we have, which can be taken forward. There are various methods through which you can generate ideas. There are a combination of both group ideation methods, individual ideation methods, and so on, which I am told will be covered as part of this session. Not sorry, this session, or this part one of this workshop. So I will not again get into the details, because there are a lot of details. I also see a lot of questions being asked. Okay, of course, brainstorming is one of the most fundamental methods that you have. You essentially start generating solutions with a brainstorming session, and there are very interesting ideation methods, or methods through which you can generate ideas, that involves participation from group members, where you can also have your stakeholder participate, your users participate, and then the features that they would like to have in their solutions gets incorporated in your ideas, and so on. There are multiple methods. I'll not get into the details, because that is really not the focus of the session. Of course, I'm going to give you an overview of design thinking here. And then once you have generated a lot of ideas, you can then evaluate your ideas against those needs and specifications to see which of these ideas best conform to the needs and specifications, and which of these solve the problem. And then if your ideas do not conform to your needs, then you modify your ideas, right? You fix your ideas so that they better conform, and then you're going to reevaluate these ideas against your needs to check whether they are conforming better or not, and then you'd select the best ideas that you think can be taken forward now. Okay. And then quickly moving to the prototype phase. So prototyping, as I mentioned before, is building an embodiment, is building your idea. So ideas are typically on a sheet of paper. You only have a knowledge of how your solutions are going to work in principle, but you would like to build them so that you can test them to see whether your solutions that you have on paper, which are now built, can be now tested to see whether it actually solves the problem or not. So you can build various forms of prototypes, physical and virtual prototypes. Okay, so prototypes can be of multiple kinds, can be of multiple forms, which again we are going to cover in more detail on the 6th of May. Again, next Wednesday, I'm going to do this session in more detail. So you're going to only prototype the selected ideas. You'll not be able to prototype all the ideas that you generate, primarily because prototyping is a very, very time and a resource consuming activity. To even build one prototype, it will take a lot of time, it will use a lot of resources depending on what prototype you build. And therefore, you are going to build prototypes only of the best ideas that got chosen from the ideate phase. So essentially, the starting point is the selected ideas or the best ideas from the ideate phase. You have a design problem statement against which you're going to evaluate these prototypes, and you have your list of needs and specifications. And the outcomes will be prototypes of different kinds. Okay, depending on what you want to test with your prototype, you will build a prototype accordingly. Right. So there are different kinds of prototypes. Okay, so you could have a prototype that is made out of cardboards. You could have prototypes that are made out of foam. You could have prototypes that are made out of clay. You could have prototypes that are laser cut, made out of cardboard and so on, and made out of different kinds of materials, metal and so on. If you're building an app, you could, for example, start with a paper or a cardboard based prototype, and then you could build wireframe models using tools like Figma, in case you are familiar with that or not familiar with that. And then you keep on increasing the levels of detail at various levels of prototypes that you have. Essentially building what I'm showing you here are the various screens that you can have for an app and so on. And then here are some prototypes that are built of a vacuum cleaner, right? Dyson vacuum cleaners, if you've heard of Dyson vacuum cleaners. For instance, the Dyson vacuum cleaner, before they actually built the product, they tested with about 5,000 different kinds of prototypes that they built, right? And of course, yes, of course, you have virtual, augmented, and virtual reality also, that is mixed reality and so on, which I am not showing you here. We'll look at what these different kinds of prototypes are in the session next week, where we'll get into the details. But essentially, what I'm trying to communicate here or convey here is that you can build different kinds of prototypes. Prototypes can be of different kinds. There are various methods and tools through which you can build prototypes, depending on what you want to test with your solutions. So you build a prototype accordingly, you build a cardboard based, paper based, clay based prototypes and so on. And you can test these different features that you have in the prototypes. Now coming back to the project, essentially now we are building an IoT based prototype. Okay, so an IoT based meaning that there are now various, so this is again talking about the project of the elderly, their medicine intake and their medicine reminders dispensers. So essentially a device that can connect multiple people, the elderly, the caregivers, the caretakers, the pharmacists, the doctors, where it will have about 5 compartments where medicines of different kinds can be stored. The device is going to will help elderly remind medicines through multiple forms of modalities. We are thinking of audio, visual, and tactile alarms. And then if medicines, the medicine intake is also tracked. If the elderly miss taking their medicines, then the communication is sent to the doctors and to the caregivers so that appropriate action can be taken, not too much time is lost. And of course, there is also a wearable that is linked to this device so that the reminding part at least gets communicated to the wearable in case the elderly are not in the proximity of the device. So that's a broad kind of thing that we are thinking. And then coming to the last phase of the design thinking. So you have built a prototype, you need to test the prototype with your users, right? And then you could test the prototype for the various aspects that need to be tested. You could test, for example, the usability of a prototype, the ease with which the prototype can be used. Of course, the first version of testing will be done by people who develop prototypes, and then once that test has been done successfully, you will then test it with the actual users or the prospective users of this device. Okay, to test these various aspects, you could test the utility of the device to see to what extent does it solve the problem that you identified in the define phase earlier. You could check the performance of the device to assess how much amount of energy gets wasted, how much of energy gets consumed, and so on and so forth, whether it conforms to the various needs and specifications that you identified before, what is the carbon footprint of the device, whether it's sustainable or not. You could account for the cost that is involved in building the device. You could account for the aesthetics. Is my prototype pleasing to the users or not, whether it looks ugly and what needs to be fixed and so on. So basically, testing allows you to identify what features are desirable, what features are undesirable, and hopefully you can fix these through testing, and then you have refined prototypes which are probably more acceptable to your users. Right? So I'm going to conclude the session now because I see a lot of questions and I'm happy to answer those questions. But before I conclude, here are the takeaways from this session. So essentially, we started by explaining what is a design. The noun form of a design is a plan, a course of action. It's a solution for a transition from an existing situation to a preferred situation. Now, why is this important? Because existing situations have undesirable elements, and in preferred situations, you would not like to have these undesirable elements. And therefore, a design as an intervention is able to mitigate or eliminate these undesirable elements. Now, designing, that is design as a process, is the process of developing designs, which involves problem understanding and problem solving. In problem understanding, you are able to identify what are the undesirable elements in my existing situation, and you are able to foresee what your preferred situation will be. You are able to envisage that. And in problem solving, you're going to develop plans, you're going to develop courses of action or solutions, and then you're going to test them to see whether this transition from existing situation to preferred situation is happening or not. And design thinking is a human-centric process or a user-centric process for innovation that is going to use methods, tools, and techniques of designers in order to solve problems in your domain. And keep in mind, you need to integrate those three aspects: the human desirability, the technological feasibility, and the market or the economic viability. All these three aspects have to be fulfilled if you want to achieve for design innovation, if you want to strive for design innovation. Design thinking is desirable because it essentially puts users or humans at the center of the process, or in as many stages as many stages or as many phases of design thinking as possible, so that their capabilities, their limitations, their preferences get accounted for, and their feedback is taken care, so that whatever outcomes or whatever solutions you develop with design thinking become more acceptable to your users, because these are your eventual people who are going to be consuming or using your solutions, and they need to see that utility, right? So, and therefore it is important to take their feedback. I talked about the various frameworks that are available for design thinking, and in detail we talked about those colorful hexagons, right? Keep in mind those 5 different phases: empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test, right? Those are the 5 phases you need to remember. And here's a quick summary of what those phases stand for. So empathize, you start with a broad problem. You put yourselves in the shoes of your stakeholders, including your users, and try to envisage what they are going through in the context of the problem. To be able to do this, you will interact with them through interviews, through focus group discussions, through surveys. You will observe them in action. You will identify what are their pain points, what are their pleasure points, and from these you're going to identify design opportunities. Okay, and then in the define phase, you're going to narrow down on a design opportunity that is most worth solving, and based on this, how might we design opportunity that you have, you're going to define a design problem, and for that design problem you're going to come up with various kinds of ideas. Okay, and then you're going to evaluate this against the needs and specifications, in order to select the best ideas that you have, and the best idea is then prototyped, and you develop at least one prototype or one version of the prototype, and you're going to test the prototype to see, and you're going to test the prototype with your users to see whether it solves the problem that you had defined before. Okay, and if it does not solve, you try and fix the prototype, and if it still does not solve the problem, you try and prototype another best idea that you've identified, and so on. Right, that's broadly the process. So that's broadly what I wanted to cover in about 90 minutes or 90 plus minutes of lecture so far. So maybe I can take in some questions and then see if that helps you understand better.
Hello everyone. I request you all to raise your hands one by one, and I'll just take your names, and then you can ask sir your questions. Okay. Okay, Aniket Agarwal, you can unmute and ask your question.
Good evening, sir. So we talked about towards the beginning of the meeting, you told us examples of design thinking, IDEO and
Yeah, the
all
different
of those
models.
things.
Yeah.
So design thinking is basically a human-centric approach where you're thinking about the users and where you're developing aesthetics and functionality, right?
Yeah.
So today, all the brands want to do that. So in that case, isn't design thinking becoming a very general term? Or do you think it's still very specific?
Well, I think design thinking as a process is generic, right? But then when you start carrying it out, that is when there are a lot of specifics, lot of details involved. There are a lot of interpretations involved. Now, for instance, now say imagine you are empathizing with a bunch of elderly. Okay, you will arrive at now your users and your stakeholders are not going to be straightforward. They're not going to tell you straightforward that this is what they think is a problem. Now it is your ability of reading between their lines,
Yeah.
between their words, to try and identify a problem. Okay, the process is generic, but then your interpretation of what you think is a problem is where your skills really come into play. Okay, so another bunch of users also are empathizing with the same amount of data will probably arrive at a very different kind of a problem and a different solutions consequently. The process is generic, but the use of think may not be as generic. It can vary from person to person depending on their skills.
All
Did
right.
I answer your question?
Yep, sir, he has written thank you in the chat. Moving on, Aradhya, would you like to ask a question? You may unmute yourself.
Good evening, sir. Sir, you mentioned that people had to wait a lot in the lifts, and so they had to come up with a solution. So they had two paths. One, they could increase the speed, and that was very expensive and very technical, and the other one was simple. They just had to install a mirror. And I've personally observed this, that whenever there is a mirror or a reflecting surface anywhere, people always make sure to look into it. So is it true, like this solution particularly is more psychological rather than technical? So is it true that psychological solutions, like we should implement psychological solutions instead of technical solutions, as they are less expensive and stuff? So should we focus more on psychological things?
Okay, so good evening, Aradhya. I mean, a good question. So let me clarify on a couple of things, right? So one perspective in that problem was to increase the speed of elevators. Now we are not taking in that perspective because there are some standards that do not allow the speed of elevators to be increased, including the speed with the rate at which the doors open and close. Okay, then the next possibility then becomes, okay, now given that this is the rate at which the doors are going to open and close, this is the speed at which the elevators are going to commute across the various floors. Now how do we still reduce the irritation or the annoyance and all those guests who then have to spend enormous amount of time waiting for the elevators to arrive at their floor and to then respectively reach their floor. So then to say, how can we enhance their waiting and their commuting experience, right? Of course, this will involve understanding their psychology, their behaviors, and so on, and then to develop a solution. And you are partly right that but of course, there is no, here I'm not creating any trade-offs between technology and behaviors, right? Those behaviors can also be incorporated or implemented through technology. Okay, so
Yeah.
so there's no trade-off here between technology and through behaviors. You'll have to understand their behaviors, and which can then eventually be implemented through technology, for instance, right? Now imagine elevators that take long to commute. You have some kind of an interactive surface within the elevator through which somebody can play a game, for instance, right? That will still allow people to feel engaged while they are commuting across floors. So I am not saying good or bad about technology, but it's important to understand their behaviors. It's important to understand the psychology of users, right? And then come up with a solution that can then take into account their behavioral and the psychological aspects. So another paradigm of design that is becoming very famous is behavioral design, where you try and understand the behaviors of your users, which I think one of the, so please post this question to Professor Pramod Khadilkar, who's in charge of actually looking at the ideation part. He'll teach you the different solution generation techniques. He'll talk more about the behavioral aspects of users. Okay, I hope I've answered your question.
All right, sir. Thank you, sir.
Yes, can take another question.
Sure. Krishang, would you like to speak up?
Yes. Good evening, sir. Sir, I have a doubt query that in design thinking, we are basically creating a layout for the final solution that we are thinking of to prepare for the problem that we have scored.
Yes, good evening, Krishank. Yes, what is the question?
Hello, Krishang. Can you repeat your question? Just a second.
Yes, sir. Sir, my question was like we do in other subjects, we first plan for the final outcome that we desire for. So why don't we skip the design thinking part and directly prepare the solution that we are aiming for?
Yeah, again, interesting question, good question. So Krishank, no harm in directly jumping to a solution, but be ready to also accept the fact that then they'll probably not be acceptable for your users. There's a chance
Okay, sir.
because you have not really taken into account the real capabilities and limitations of your users. What are their preferences, and you want the solution to be taken for users. Imagine, and now keep in mind that this is a problem. It is not your problem. It's a problem for the users, and there's also a solution for the users or your prospective
Okay.
users. And therefore,
And
it
sir,
is design thinking allows you to understand what is it that they want before you actually narrow down on a problem. Okay, so you'll have to
okay,
understand
sir.
that first before you start developing solutions and then testing those solutions with your users. And that is why design thinking becomes important.
And sir, an ideal design thinking should take how much time according to you?
It really depends on the problem, depends on what kinds of solutions you are going to develop, depends on your team size, depends on your domain knowledge, and so on, right? So design thinking can also be done in a matter of 1 day, it can be done in 2 days, can be done over 7 days, can be done for 1 year, can be done for 3 years, can be done for 5 years. Depends on how intensively you carry out each of those 5 phases in the process.
And so just a last question. Like we see, we have many R&D teams in many startups and businesses. Are those R&D teams currently focusing on design thinking in the current era or time?
They are definitely considering design thinking in the sense that they consider the humans and the user centric process. See, they might have their own. I mean, I think the companies and the organizations will have their own ways of doing design thinking, but they definitely take into consideration this empathize phase and then testing the solutions with their users and so on. That they do.
Oh, thank you, sir.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right, we'll take Hitesh now. Hitesh Gupta, can you unmute and ask?
Yes, good evening, sir. Sir, my question is you told that design thinking requires a lot of testing and prototyping, and it is a very time-consuming and resource-consuming process. So, do you think that design thinking should be applied for simpler problems also, like it should be taken seriously for simpler problems also, or only for complex or systemic issues?
Yeah, okay. So good evening, Hitesh. Let me clarify on a couple of things. I mentioned prototyping is very resourceful and time intensive. Okay, because prototyping essentially involves building things, right? So
Yes,
which
sir.
will require procuring of materials in case you don't have any, will involve using whatever equipment that is needed for prototyping and so on. And so I mentioned you cannot. So typically when you generate ideas for a problem, you might generate about at least 15 to 20 ideas or 15 to 20 solutions on paper. Okay, so it is not possible for you to prototype or build all of these 15 20 solutions. So you're going to evaluate these ideas or solutions, and then you're going to select the best solutions, and you're going to prototype, and which might you might end up with only about 2 or 3 solutions which you will prototype. Okay, so that way you are saving time and you're only prototyping what you think are going to be the most likely and successful solutions. That's the first part of it, right? The second part of the question, what was the second question? Sorry, I forgot.
Sir, that should it be taken seriously for all problems like smaller problems also, or only for complex problems?
Okay, so I don't know what you mean by simple problem and a complex problem. Uh, there are there are so when the number of stakeholders increase, right? I don't know, Hitesh, where you are from, where you come from. For example, the air pollution problem in Delhi, right? That actually
Yes, sir.
involves multiple stakeholders, right? You can still apply design thinking, and the kind of solutions you will come up with are probably masks for people and so on. But it still does not will not solve the solution problem, which is to prevent solution in the first place, right? Because it is still not very clear as to what is causing the solution. So maybe a combination of design thinking along with system level thinking, right, together can solve such what we call as complex problems, where there are multiple stakeholders involved, and sometimes it is not even clear who the stakeholders are.
Okay, sir.
Okay.
Thank you,
Anyway,
sir.
please do look up at systems level thinking also. That goes slightly beyond, but yeah, good question.
Okay, sir, I'll surely do.
Yes, we can go to the next person.
All right, sir. Sir, I think we can take Sumant. Sumant, would you like to unmute?
So, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Good evening, sir. So, my question was that the 5 steps that you had given in the hexagon. So, is it like the second step that we need to follow? Like, if we are working on a problem, the first step would be to truly understand the problem. So, the 5 steps you have given would be the second step for the problem, problem solving.
So all the five phases have to be carried out if you want to solve the problem. Let me clarify that. The first phase is to empathize, to try and identify who your stakeholders are. Let me just perhaps quickly go there. I think this was. I hope you are able to see the slide now. So you'll have to carry out all the phases, meaning you'll have to go through all the hexagons if you want to solve the problem. The first phase is about identifying what are the pain points experienced as perceived by your stakeholders, including your users. Okay. And then from these pain points, you're going to narrow down on one pain point that is probably worth solving. And for that, you're converting that into a design opportunity using a how might we, and then defining a design problem around that. Okay. That's the define phase. And then in the ideate phase, you're going to come up with various kinds of ideas for the problem that you have defined, and you're going to evaluate and select what you think are the best ideas. Those best ideas will be prototyped in the prototyping phase, and then will be tested with your users in the testing phase.
Okay, sir.
And then if the prototype needs to be fixed or another idea needs to be chosen, you go back to those phases. So essentially, you need to carry out all of these 5 phases at least once to
So
be
yeah,
able to solve the problem, to be able to define and solve the problem.
yes, sir. So in the first part, we actually understood the problem, as in before the design part, we understood how to deeply understand the problem.
Yeah.
So from here, we have to choose our required audience and then empathize on them and then further work.
Correct.
Okay, sir. Yes, thank you, sir.
All right, sir. How many more questions can we take?
We can take, no problem. I still
No
have.
problem. Okay. Freya, would you like to speak up? I'm sorry if I missed.
Yes, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
So, sir, I had a problem. Basically, the problem that I have noticed around me, its stakeholders is a very niche audience. So, not too many people are impacted by the problem, but the ones who are affected will greatly benefit from a solution if it exists. So, should I pick a wider problem or should I continue with this one, even if the impact may be a little less?
Okay. Good evening, Priya. I think it's a good question. What if it is only a niche audience? I mean, of course, see, for the purpose of learning design thinking, you can perhaps choose a problem that has wider audience.
Okay.
But design thinking will also work for niche audience. In such kinds of cases, you, for example, will then go to the next level of stakeholders and see if you can get access to them. Now, let me give you an example. Okay. Now, imagine that I have to use design thinking to try and come up with an educational toy for an infant. Okay. Now, infants is niche audience because I cannot really interact with them in the sense that I cannot interview them, I cannot conduct a focus group discussion with them, I cannot ask them to fill a survey. Whatever thing that I want to come up with them, probably I'll then go to the next level of stakeholder, which is their parents. And then whatever the parents have about the physical and the mental makeup of their child, and then I'm going to take in that as my input in the empathize phase. And I'm also going to fill in information from my literature. Literature will also reveal a lot of information about niche audience. People may have carried out similar studies before, and that can still be used as a source of information with which now you can define your design problem. So if the organizers can help unmute Freya, she wants to perhaps speak more.
Sir, I wanted to unmute too. I understood your answer. Thank you for the.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Your next question, please.
All right, we can take up Hitarth.
Sir, I wanted to ask that if we are identifying a problem, and at that time, if the problem goes too wide that the solution could be gone unpractical for today's world, so how should we try to narrow it down?
I mean, could you give me an example, Hitarth?
For example, I was trying a competition of Kumbh Mela. So in that competition, I had an idea of mapping all the incidents, which like stampedes and all happening over there. So I wanted to map the whole map of Kumbh Mela. But when we were starting to find the solution to it, that how we could do it, it was getting a lot of unpractical while we started solving it. So how could we narrow it down?
Um, you don't have to narrow down the problem. You probably then have to come up with solutions that are implementable. Now, from what your narration, what I understand is your intention is to reduce the number of stampede incidents in Kumbh Mela like crowd. Is that
Yeah.
correct? So
Yes.
then, yeah, of course, there are multiple kinds of solutions you can come up with in order to reduce stampede or stampede like incidents. You don't have to
Okay.
narrow down the problem. I think the problem is generic enough. I think there's also specific focus on the problem.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Okay, yeah, but think more about your solutions.
All right, we can have Amit next.
Yeah,
Hello, sir.
yeah.
Sir, I was basically thinking about the feasibility part of design thinking. Does a design solution that we create to eradicate the problem always have to be a product that utilizes technology? Like, for example, if we thought that human service, like a support group, would work the best and would be better to solve the user's problem better than an app. So would that still be considered a valid design in this framework? Is it mandatory that a design solution always has to harness some technology or thing?
Yeah. Hello, good evening, Amit. So it does not have to particularly use any technology. It can also be just human service, for example, right? Um, but then one can also think about implementing human service through technology, for instance.
If you could guide
So,
how?
for instance, right, one of the things that we observed with the elderly people is
Mhm.
social loneliness. Okay,
Right.
social loneliness because they are away from their children, grandchildren, or probably like-minded people. Now, imagine you have a solution that helps elderly connect with each other so that they can create social groups,
Mhm.
right? I mean, the idea is still to have human groups together, but the enabler could be technology, for instance. I mean, I'm not saying that technology has to be mandatorily included, but technology is only, I see that only as an enabler.
Okay, means indirectly we can use the technology to bind the people also,
Yeah,
like human
you
service.
can use technology, but it's not mandatory.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We can take Saket next.
Thank you, sir. So, a very good evening, sir. So, I wanted to ask, suppose a person has followed the design thinking pattern and he has created the prototype for his problem. So, now he is in the testing phases. So, how it is the best way to connect to people to actually like test your product? Because as you said, testing it ourselves is
I'm sorry, I'm not able to hear. I mean,
Hello,
it is.
Saket, we lost you. We
hello.
can't hear you. Now
Yeah.
we can hear you.
Yeah. Yes, sir. So I was saying that um, whenever a person creates a prototype, for example, and he is now in the testing phases, so he has created the product and he he wishes to test it. So as you said, it is better to connect to people to test the product rather than doing it himself. So what is the best way a person can reach out to maximum people because he can't just market his product before launching it. So what's the best way? So, like, can't he do it on his own?
So there are at least two levels of testing. Okay. At the first level, the developers test by themselves. There are various parameters against which they would test for depending on what needs to be tested. And then once that is done, then they test it with the prospective users. The design is still not taken to the market. So you can have people, invite them, make them use the prototype or whatever version of the design that you have at that particular stage, and then test whatever you want to test with the users. Ultimately, if the intention is to take your design to the market, it should be at a stage where you can actually test and see whether it solves the problem or not. It has to be tested until that level, and various other tests that depending on what is the nature of the product. Okay.
All right, we can take Prachi next.
So, good evening, sir. My question is that if we have a problem which is related on the lack of awareness, thing which we can't do, like if we have to solve a problem, if we like can kind of launch any campaign event, like a campaign solution. So, do we have to actually particularly surround those who are being affected? So, like for example, if we take any issue related to any adolescent. So do we have to involve the all the factors like their school, like their parents, to actually launch that solution, or do we have to actually mainly focus on the person who is focusing on the like the adolescent people?
Yeah. So, yes, again, an interesting question. This is something that I did not dwell upon in greater detail. So, while you're identifying your stakeholders, right, there is something called as a stakeholder map. Please to look up for. I'm happy to share you links. You can write to me. Stakeholder map is helps you identification of stakeholders at various levels. For the problem that you described, the most affected or the most influential people are the adolescents, right? And at the next level, which is the secondary level, there are people who are linked to these adolescents. For example, it could be the parents of these adolescents, it could be the siblings of the adolescents who might or might not be adolescents themselves. There could be teachers in schools or teachers in colleges who are linked to these adolescents and so on. So those people also need to be considered because they also exert some level of influence and in turn are getting affected by whatever interventions we are going to come up with. So their inputs also need to be taken. And then at some level, you'll also need to take into account the colleges and so on. Because again, it will depend on what kinds of solutions you will implement. A solution that you want to implement, for example, at an organizational level, as a college level or a school level, you will still need the consent from the authorities in school. So it's better that you take in their inputs also before you start developing solutions. So please look at this thing called stakeholder map, right? That will help you identify the various kinds of stakeholders at multiple levels so that you're able to get a very holistic input before you start developing solutions.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we can take Astha next.
Thank you, sir. Hello, sir. What I would like to ask is the very first step you told us about today was empathy. Like, it's not pity, it's to get yourself into the shoes of the vulnerable group. But then you mentioned solution neutrality. So, how do I ensure that I'm solution neutral while being empathetic? Because empathy is the first phase, like the first step. I do not have the vision or the research work to be solution neutral at that time. How do I ensure that?
Yeah. So, good evening, Asta. So, I don't understand the contradiction here. So, see, empathy is you're trying to understand from the perspective of your users and your stakeholders as to what they are going through physically, mentally, behaviorally in the context of the broad problem. Okay. And then, based on that, you are framing the problem without being biased towards any particular solution. You are open to multiple solution paths. Now, the intention of framing a solution neutral problem statement is to ensure that you're not getting biased only on one solution or fixating on one solution. Now, a solution, a non-solution neutral problem statement, for example, will not allow a human mind to think beyond a particular perspective. You don't want that. You want to explore multiple perspectives to see which perspective actually helps to solve them better than others. Am I making sense, Asta? She is probably not able to unmute herself.
Yes, sir. But But how do I ensure that I'm not biased because I'm empathetic?
No, what I am, no, no, no. See, so empathy, see, the kind of bias you are referring to is the bias on the problem. Okay, that problem, that is okay, because you essentially are translating whatever problems are faced by users, and then based on that you are translating that into a problem. The bias that I am talking about is the bias on the solution. Do not be biased or fixated on a particular solution, because it is
Okay.
very, very typical of human nature. You look at a problem, for example, right? There's immediately a solution that comes to your mind. That is very, very typical of human mind. And then the problem is we get caught in that solution. We think that's the best solution for the problem. On the contrary, research has found that solutions that actually appear in the beginning do not tend to solve the problem very well, because the human mind does not see through that problem, and that solution is just the top of the mind solution. So the solutions that actually appear later in the process, as you develop and explore further, they tend to solve the problem more holistically than the solutions that appear in the beginning.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
All right, we can take the last question from Tanav.
Okay, thank you, sir. Good evening, sir. Like you had mentioned, like we need to choose the best problem that suits the concerned stakeholder. So, how do we categorize, or what are the criteria for choosing the best problem?
Yeah. So typically, I think what you can do, for instance, is, I don't know if in this exercise you're going to be solving the problem alone or if it is within a group. If it is within a group, then you, for example, all the members in the team can vote, and then along with the justification criteria that you can have for your own. There is no one solution, there's no one answer to your question. So you can, depending on what that context is, you think that this is the best problem to solve. Your team members can either agree with you, can contradict you, so on. And then based on the individual stances and their points of view, you then take an opinion to say what path that you want to take, or what problem you want to solve, depending on the criticality of the problem, depending on how important the problem is to be solved. Now, it could be, right, the list of problems that you've arrived at, they're all linked to each other, right? And there could be some problems that are more like symptoms, and there could be a problem that is actually the root cause. So you might then want to actually solve a problem that is the root cause and not just the symptoms. I believe that in the previous session you had some session on root cause analysis. Is that
Yes,
correct?
sir.
So
Yes.
that, for example, can help you identify the most important problem that is worth solving. Now, another set of criteria that is worth looking at is to really see that the problem is not too big, so big that it cannot be solved within a particular time frame or within the set of resources that you have. Okay. Now, let me give you a very, very hypothetical problem or a bunch of problems, right? Now, for instance, I could think of coming up with developing a problem of developing a rover that can go through the lunar surface, or I can think about a rover that can that can rove around or roam around both the lunar as well as the surface and Mars, or I can think about a rover that can actually go and explore space and other planets. All of these are valid. I would rather choose a problem that is low hanging, right? For example, I would just choose a lunar surface, right? Because my time is limited, my resources are limited, right? But then I can also contradict myself, for example, and see where the novelty is. I can see, for example, a particular problem, even though the scope is very, very wide, but it has never been solved before. So let me try and focus on that problem. And this is where the insights from the literature can actually help you. So there are multiple perspectives you can look at. So if you have a specific example, then we can discuss more. Okay, hopefully.
Yes, sir. And like I was thinking about the flooding in the nearby areas of the river banks that flows through it, and one of the possible reasons was that due to the overpopulation, there's illegal construction on the river banks. So how could we go about it?
Okay. Yeah, this is now you also saying it is because of overpopulation, right? So now, I mean, it is up to you now to say how do you limit the population. I would not focus on the other problem. I would now say how do I, because the root cause here is, as you point out, is the population, overpopulation, overpopulating areas which are close to the banks of rivers or water bodies, right? So then the problem statement becomes, then how do you control the population in the proximity of the banks of the rivers and other water bodies?
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you.
I hope everyone's questions was answered. Thank you so much, sir, for this really fruitful and helpful session. And we are very happy to have you here. And I'm sure the students learned a lot. Being a design student myself, I loved the session, and uh, we look forward to meeting you again sometime.
Okay.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Ishmeet, and then thanks to all the students. Hopefully, they found the session useful, and hopefully, they're able to make sense of the content and then put them to use. And of course, they'll be able to find my email address and all that from the web. If they have any specific questions, they can email me, and then I'm happy to answer. Thank you all. Yeah.
All right, sir. All right, everyone, we are ending the meeting now. And also, don't worry about today's assignment. We have extended it till midnight. Please complete it on time. Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.